Scholars are able to state with certainty that Jesus of Nazareth existed as a real historical individual. Those who argue for a mythic Jesus ironically resemble not discerning scholars, but instead the most ardent fundamentalists. Like fundamentalists, deniers of a historical Jesus seem to believe that the traditional narrative is either 100% true or 100% false, and they cannot stomach shades of gray. And they can't, or won't, accept that reality may not demarcate itself so conveniently as to adhere to their rigid ideological preconceptions. Because of the abundant literary evidence that Jesus was a real historical person, the first arguments made by those holding to a mythic view is that all sources are unreliable and of no historical value whatsoever. Frequently, this manifests in claims about the reliability of the four canonical Gospels, with detractors highlighting that they are theological narratives written decades after Jesus' death. The argument goes that because the Gospels contain inconsistencies and embellishments, that they cannot be trusted. This same objection is then extended to all other New Testament sources, with the line of logic being that because they were written with religious and moral convictions in mind, that they cannot be utilized by historians, even to testify to basic facts, such as the existence of a historical Jesus. Yet the standard proposed here, that the presence of supernatural elements or a clear agenda on the part of the author discounts the entirety of a source, is clearly flawed and cannot be universally applied. For example, Plutarch's Lives is regarded as a flawed but largely reliable source, even though in places it contradicts other ancient sources, often integrates miraculous elements, and the work was written with the express purpose of providing moral instruction. Plutarch's editorial gloss is so heavy that he rearranges events and presents direct quotes in their entirety, which seem highly unlikely to be authentic. Yet this is not, and has never been, a reason to discount his work, as the historical method, which has helped highlight these flaws, in turn illuminates what is of value. This is why the Gospels, and the entirety of the New Testament beyond them, are valuable sources to scholars, even if they do not accept that they accurately portray the life of Jesus. Consider the historical Socrates for a moment. He wrote no works of his own, and is chiefly conveyed to us in the writings of his student Plato, which scholars have long recognized as more reflective of Plato's own views. The fact that Plato inserts many sayings into the mouth of his mentor that he likely never uttered does not imply that these sources cannot be used to infer the existence of a historical Socrates, nor does it prohibit us from speculating as to what his original teaching may have been. Similarly, the declining popularity of Platonism as a philosophical school does not mean that the sources are any less valuable. One does not need to adhere to the theory of forms to see the value of Plato for historians studying ancient Athens. When it comes to the study of the historical Jesus, employing approaches such as multiple attestation, coherence, dissimilarity, embarrassment, and contextual plausibility are employed to evaluate the probability of an event or a saying being historical. By using these criteria, historians can sift through the layers of tradition to reconstruct the most plausible portrait of Jesus that is compatible with the available evidence. Because so much is left to the interpretation of each scholar, it should come as no surprise that there are a wide range of views on the historical Jesus, ranging from a failed apocalyptic prophet in the Jewish tradition to the position that he was the divine Son of God. There is robust debate, and will be for the foreseeable future. But even amidst this, there is no doubt at all that he was a real person, even if there is substantial disagreement about what he did and said. But because references to Jesus are not limited to the Gospels, efforts to deny his historicity must also extend to encompass all the non-Christian and non-canonical sources that acknowledge Jesus. References to him appear, for example, in the Talmud, as well as the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historians Pliny, Suetonius, and Tacitus. These references are brief and often hostile, indicating that they were not fabricated out of whole cloth by later Christians. Though there is a consensus that a certain passage in Josephus concerning Jesus was embellished by later Christian scribes, it is this same textual critical approach that validates the others. One cannot consistently claim that all are fabrications along the lines of the embellished Josephus passage without invalidating the very approach that allows us to infer alterations in the first place. To do so is to apply an inconsistent standard to historical evidence, a tactic frequently employed by those arguing a mythic position. Often, after whittling down the number of acceptable sources to near zero, mythicists will point to the absence of archaeological evidence for Jesus to support their claim that he was a fictional creation of later writers. But if this were the standard for establishing the existence of historical figures, which would remain among countless other issues, such an approach would yield little more than a history of the hyper-elite. Anyone who has wandered the Louvre or the Prado knows that having the desire and the means to leave definitive proof of one's existence is largely the domain of forgotten nobles. Insistence on an archaeological record highlights the absurd standard to which Jesus is uniquely held by those advocating a mythic position. So, while we don't have as much evidence of the existence of Jesus as we do for Augustus, we must recognize that the radically different social positions of the two men would naturally lead to different types of historical records for each emerging within their lifetime and the subsequent decades. The evidence that we have for Jesus is precisely what we would expect for a peasant from a remote and insignificant village in Galilee. Though he built a strong following, Jesus never held any political or religious office, nor did he write anything or leave any material traces of his existence. His marginal status is underscored by his execution via crucifixion, one of the two facts about his life that is universally accepted by all scholars in the field. For his entire life, Jesus was of no real significance to the powerful, so we should not be surprised that he cannot match the attestation of the emperors or those that existed at the upper echelons of Roman society. Evidence for Jesus, however, outpaces that available for similar historical figures in his region and era. Furthermore, if we examine literary evidence alone, then we have more biographical works on Jesus than even giant figures of world history, such as Caligula. For the third Roman emperor, we are left with only two detailed accounts of his reign, the historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio. Furthermore, Suetonius's history was written 80 years after the death of Caligula, while Cassius Dio's account came over 150 years after Caligula's assassination. This helps contextualize the appearance of the canonical Gospels 30 to 60 years after Jesus' life, as relatively recent when we consider the timing of such works in the ancient world. For those who still believe this is too late to have any historical value, we must remember that the earliest surviving account of Alexander the Great's life comes roughly 275 years after his death. Again, this is not to suggest that one must consider the Gospels or any ancient sources to be 100% accurate, but that's not necessary to concede that Jesus did actually exist. The ancient sources could very well be unintentionally or even intentionally misrepresenting the words of Jesus, but the sheer wealth of documentary evidence, both Christian and non-Christian, testifies to the existence of a historical person at the core of the Jesus story. To dismiss the abundant evidence for Jesus as insufficient or entirely fabricated is to ignore the nature and limitations of ancient historiography and to impose an unrealistic criterion of historical verification.